is a British dystopian science fiction novel set in an alternate reality of an alternate history timeline of the 1990s, where human cloning, has allowed for widespread organ harvesting, and the as a result, they have a subclass, a servant class, if you will, of cloned people who serve as lifelong organ donors and have no real concept of life outside of their role as living organ farms. And it was adapted into the 2010 film directed by Mark Romanek, with a screenplay by Alex Garland, and starring Carey Mulligan, Keira Knightley, and Andrew Garfield. So it is a very a profound novel. I would say a character driven novel, and more precisely a study in the portrayals of emotions. This is a book that really asks you to sit and appreciate the emotional stages of people who have an extraordinary level of naivete about their prescribed roles in society, and very much asks you to think about the mindset of people who find themselves in this sort of slave class existence without fully understanding that that's what they're doing. And we are going to divide the review up into two halves so that we can discuss. For the first half will be spoiler free, and then we can shift gears and discuss some of the themes and topics that happen that are readily apparent in the novel once we know everything that's going on. The story tells of three specific characters. Tells of three specific characters: Kathy, Ruth, and Tommy. It is told from Kathy's perspective. Her friends Ruth and Tommy are fellow students at a boarding school when the novel begins, when the story begins. They're all three students at a boarding school that's fairly mysterious and hush hush in its tone, and it is revealed to us early in the novel that this is a boarding school entirely for cloned people who are going to be eventually harvested in their mid-20s, have their organs harvested in their mid-20s. So the story is built around the friendship between these three, the love triangle that emerges, and that sort of thing as they go through their lives at the school, then later living in kind of planned communities for cloned people, and then eventually approaching the inevitable reality of their donating organs to the cause. So that's the structure of the story. I thought it was very bittersweet and bleak and just beautiful in its writing, and I think this is really a book that, like I said, wants you to sit with the emotions of these characters and the thought processes of these characters. It's a very gentle, very subtle novel, and because of that, it's all the more emotionally poignant. Stefan, what did you think?
I had a bit of a mixed feeling with the novel itself. I would say that the author is really good in the capacity that, let's say, an Anton Chekhov knows how to break rules. And when you think of the structure of a story, beginning, middle, ending, or four part acts, or however you think of a story is going to flow, this doesn't do that. And that's why the first half, it took me so long to get through the first half, just because it was so droll and samey and slice of life-ish, which I've gotten used to reading a lot of Japanese authors. They tend to do that a lot, which is totally fine as a genre. But you don't know what's the point of all of this, because you know the setup. Everyone's a clone. They're all going to die, and they're all set up for this whatever donation is going to take place in the future. But it's from the perspective of mostly of Kathy, and she's sort of the narrator. And you're like, okay, she's a young girl. She's interested in boys and all young girl stuff and going to a school and high school and doing all this jazz, and you're just like, is this the story? And then once you get past that bump of now they're out into the world and doing whatever it is they were set to do, it's just sort of this downhill, like, oh, this is it. This is your life. You're going to die early. You're going to deal with other people's problems that are also having donations, and there's no world building in the capacity of what the donations are outside of you're giving away organs, and there's no explanation as to what the medicine was outside of, well, you're curing cancer, you're doing this and that, and that's how you do it. And that's when you get into the interesting parts, because science fiction aspects that we're interested in for these sorts of themes and genres are, what's the world like? Who are the major players? What are the powers that be? And instead, we're just resolved to, well, we're just, a bunch of people in this not as sophisticated Gattaca world that, what do you do with these people that have to grow and resolve? So the first half of the book, I'd say even first 60% of the book, I absolutely hated. It was droll. It was hard to get through until you get to the interesting parts. And you're like, oh, now they're resolving things. Now they're explaining things. Now they're telling us what's going to happen. So that's where my mind went, if only this was written by Vonnegut, we would have started there and then have even more interesting reveals. But, you could start in this bleak sort of mundane way and sort of figure out what's going on and hopefully get to somewhere interesting. And we did. We got a lot of resolution. We got a lot of clarity. And that's what this story really needed. So it's kind of like you're going on a restaurant that's really well known, and this guy's really good at it. And the chef doesn't care about the entree. He doesn't care about the appetizer. He doesn't care about the cocktail before. And it's all like, who cares? It's really about the dessert. And once you get to that dessert, you're like, oh my goodness, this is a fantastic restaurant. So it's that sort of slow burn. It gets better as the more you read it. I know I hate to say that to any book because you want everything to be great, but it's one of those slow burns. If you stick through it, you might enjoy it and you might like what you're reading. It's not just for sci-fi. I wouldn't say it's actually science fiction oriented at all. There's maybe one mystery that doesn't get resolved, which is fine because it's not important. But it's going to be a very heartwarming and sad, almost melancholic story for some people because of it's just a bunch of kids, and they're going to go through their pacing, and they're going to slowly get out of the picture as their fate catches up with them. So, yeah, it's sad. It is a sad story.
It is. And it's interesting you point out the science fiction aspect of it being very downplayed, and I think this is, I think people have nowadays lost capacity for the term speculative fiction, which is a far better expression. Speculative fiction is more just like is less about the science of how we'll be living in 50 to 100 years, and it's more about just what kind of people will we be in 50 to 100 years, that kind of thing. And this is more like that, and especially because you could really do this world, like if you even if we don't have human cloning down pat, you could have a and I'm not saying this is at all a desirable thing, obviously, but you could have like an untouchable class in society who are bred in captivity entirely for the sake of donating their organs, and basically have this world that's described in the book. And that's what was interesting to me, because I was actually talking to a friend the other night about this who had a really good point. She said, you really don't, there's really not any proof given that these people are actually clones. That could just be a lie. That could just be a lie that they're told, that the world at large is told, that kind of thing. And they are just, orphans and runaways or something like that. And, there's things like, yes, they're sterile and they can't have kids, but you could sterilize children, that sort of thing. I mean, that's not outside the bounds of possibility. So I thought that was very interesting, and just the very subtle implications of it. And one of the things I thought about with the the slow burn at the first 60% of the novel, like you're talking about, before things start really rolling in the last act. Uh, I think it's almost like, we talked about, one of the things they talked about was the way the kids at the school are educated towards their eventual role as organ donors, where they give them the information about it, but they tell them about it in at times where where the kids are really thinking about other things. So they get them slowly acclimated to their reality, and they point that out in the book by saying, well, when they were giving the kids sex ed at like, like a sixth grade level or grade six level or something about then, when they're giving the kids sex ed, they slip in there, oh, by the way, none of you are going to be able to have children. You're all sterile. And the kids are more thinking about sex and the hormonal ecstasies of that. And they, that piece of knowledge is slipped in on them. And really, from a narrative standpoint, the bleakness of this story is slipped into and the awareness of how bleak the story is slipped in subtly and carefully through that opening part, while we're focused on other things. While we're focused on going to a dollar store in the village and finding a cassette tape that they like and that kind of thing. And so I think doing that, it's very interesting. It's a very interesting build up towards what eventually happens. And I want to, at this point, throw down the gauntlet of spoiler alert, because I want to transition into talking about the ultimate resolution of this. So, spoiler alert. If you want to jump ship now, I highly recommend it, because what ultimately happens is these kids never rebel. We keep waiting for them to rebel, but they really just resign themselves to their fate and go through it. And in the movie adaptation, that's especially impactful, because they really show you the Keira Knightley really suffering as a result of this, and ultimately dying on the operating table. But the but throughout this movie, or throughout the story, I should say, in the book, I'm sitting here waiting for waiting for these three kids to rebel and to run away. And like, we automatically assume, if we're telling a story like this, it's like they're going to run away, and maybe one of them doesn't make it, or two of them don't make it, but finally one of them escapes to an island somewhere where the clones are able to live, as have a refuge for the clones, and they're able to live in safety and sanctuary for the rest of their lives. Like, we expect something like that, and that's not what this is. And so I was very curious about that, and I was looking through different discussions of it, trying to find something, and I found some comments from the director of the movie adaptation, where he said that these that he asked Kazuo Ishiguro about that. Why do these three kids never rebel? And his basic response was that in Western fiction, we have this fascination with the noble individual that stands up against the injustices of the world. But the reality is, most slaves don't rebel. And he wanted to get into the psychology of the people who don't rebel. And I think that's very interesting. And the director of the film also pointed out that when he shows the movie in places like Russia and China and Japan, where your service to the your life is, from the time you're born, is geared towards your service to the collective and your service to the whole of society, that question never comes up. They never ask about that. And I thought that was so haunting and so profound, that one of the greatest, they say they say the strongest chains are the ones you don't know you're wearing. And it's very true. I think that's extremely true here. That the most, this is not a dystopian world of prisons and guards and that sort of thing. These characters are allowed to roam around the cities and do what kind of live their lives. It's just when it's time to do their donations, they report to the various clinics and surgical centers and donate their organs. And it's just, that's what's the most haunting thing, is that these people are oppressed not by guns and prison walls and that sort of thing. They're oppressed by societal norms and cultural belief systems and that sort of thing. And that's what was most profound to me. What did you take out of the last third?
Uh, well, with the idea of them being supposedly the most intelligent or the best of all of the supposed schools or farms that did this, Hailsham was the name of the agency, and they were, oh wow, you're from Hailsham. Oh, this is everything, and you're the best, and all the best people come from there. And no one really knew what that meant outside of when we learned at the ending that they treat them like people or try to treat them like people as best they can.
Yeah.
So when we see that, you're like, okay, that's great. But in terms of them rebelling or going against some sort of authority, once you read the first quarter of the book, you're like, okay, this is a slice of life. There's no action scenes. There's no combat. There's no action adventure. So the genre is very specific. And if it were to suddenly do that, I'd be very surprised near the end if like a bomb was set up or someone decided to go make a run for it. I don't think that was ever an issue. It was the nature of their upbringing. I think that was the story. And then once you learn like the sex is talked about, but not very openly. And then once you learn that no, Ruth was sleeping around, and so was this girl, and so was that guy. It's like, oh, okay. So they had these relationships, but they were just acting on impulse, and that was just a thing. And that was to me that was rather shocking because why would these people who supposedly care about each other or are very concerned about getting I think a deferral, that was the hope, that they would talk to the ex-dean or whomever and say, hey, we love each other. We don't want to go through this donation process. Here's the proof of our love. We do actually care for each other. And Ruth was sort of secretly against that because she wanted to have some sort of deferral. I don't know. Like that was never, in my mind, it was never going to happen. I didn't know what was going to happen exactly with the reveal because I didn't think that was necessary to the story. But we knew they were going to die. That was a given. That was if they took that away from us, that would be strange. So for the first half, because I said it was like a dystopian. Speculative fiction is a good word because I wasn't sure if it was the 60s or the 80s. And that I liked because it's like the setting is interesting. Where are we? Who's doing what?
Yeah.
Who's in control? Is there a government figure? There was no government figure. It was just the school. And we learned there was barbed wire and there was a boat and keeping it closed off. So there was some control. But yeah, everyone accepts their fates. They're well raised. And you have to imagine those 4 other places or 3 or 4 other places didn't do that at all. They were just in a pen. And maybe if the animalistic aspect of that was showcased, then we've got a really great contrast because people are saying Hailsham's amazing. Like, oh, that means other places are horrible. So what does that mean? And we never got a taste of that outside of knowing there was some interesting sci-fi element like cloning for superior races. And you're like, ooh, what's that eugenics program just popped up? It was called the Mailberg incident or something like that. That was like, ooh, then my science fiction memories are going, ooh, I want to start there. What's going on here? So my brain was always thinking of the dystopian world, but it's not really horrific, but it's still tragic in the sense that, the Scythe world that we read with Neil Shusterman, that had, these big echelons of society and people in control. But we're just reading about the nurses that scrape people off the ground after they commit suicide. I think that's the story. So you have to get into that realm. They're just a bunch of healthcare workers essentially who are raised to be donators, and
Donors.
it's just like, oh, we know what's going on. It's kind of like if you had a donor card, but you're going to say, okay, I'm going to die I'm going to die within 10 years.
Yeah.
And you say, okay, I'm going to do that. And everyone's just like, okay, yeah, that's what we are. That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
And there's no sense of family. There is a family of friends, obviously, that they were raised together, but there's no sense of mom and dad and a community. It's just you're all students, and you're all just sort of fighting and falling in love and getting along with each other and just saying, yeah, this is it. This is your life.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it's interesting. Yeah. And it's interesting that when they finally speak to the former headmistress of Hailsham, she points out that, we were able to at least give you childhoods. And I thought that was very interesting that they they were, they knew that they could not, they knew that there was no way to end this program, that, if you ask people to go back to the time of, cancer and heart disease and all that, the answer is no. But so they knew there was no way to end the program, but they wanted to, they wanted to at least give them this very idyllic time in their lives and everything. And that was one question that haunted me, was like, I wonder if in giving them that idyllic time in their lives, are you giving them, are you helping them have something special, or are you just, is that just manipulating them to resign them to their fate, because children are so impressionable
right.
and everything?
It reminded me, there is a episode of Star Trek Enterprise, a very unpopular series of the Star Trek series, I know. It was called Cogenitor, or it was a story about three sexes, or an alien race that had three sexes, and one of the sexes was just considered used for procreation. It's just that they don't talk to them. They just realize that that's part of their existence. They need them to procreate. So it's a big deal when this apparently advanced species procreates. And in the story, I think it's Trip, the engineer. He goes and talks to this person who's, they can talk, but they just sit there and they do nothing. He's like, hey, I'm human. Who are you? And they have a conversation, and they start teaching them things like, hey, this is Mozart, this is Beethoven. It's amazing, and they're so emotional. They're so like, oh my God, life is so much broader than I thought. That if I were to be reduced to just being in the corner again, I would kill myself, and that's exactly what happened. So it's like this experiment in dystopia. What would happen to normal people? Well, you can't give them too much, or they're going to rebel, which didn't really come across as like a school for the gifted, or a school for like like the whole mystery was the the paintings and the pictures, and I was like, that's not relevant. That's the back of my mind is like, it's not going to matter much. But what do you do with people who are going to be livestock essentially?
Yeah.
So, and you're trying to give this sense of family, and if you do that, you're just going to lead them up the garden path into hopes and dreams that will never, or if they do amount to anything, it's going to be very, very short-lived. Yeah. And I think that was one of the was Miss Lucy. I think that was the big philosophy. Miss Lucy says, no, we got to tell them everything. We got to show them all the truth. And other people were like, no, if we do that, they're going to kill each other. They're going to commit suicide. They have nothing to live for. So that was, to me, like the sci-fi interesting element was Miss Lucy, that just was mentioned briefly in the start and mentioned briefly at the end. And I was like, oh, that would have been a great sense of conflict in this story that otherwise was very Melba Toast and chill and slow until we got to the major reveals. And that's where my brain went, oh, at least the writer knows how to write to clean up the threads and resolve the plot and get to the point of the story, which is, this is all for naught. It doesn't matter. You're all going to die. That's life. And I thought, now that we got that, now it makes more sense. Before, I was just like, slice of life. Anything can happen. We don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think there's some very profound kind of symbolic moments. One of the that really resonated with me. One is, Tommy, the character of Tommy, is set up very early in the story as having, as a little boy, having these problems with anger management, that he, flies off the rails very quickly and starts screaming and that sort of thing, just not just chaotically screaming. And we bring that back at the very end of the novel, where Tommy, now a young man who has supposedly grown out of that, collapses by the side of the road and just has this cathartic screaming, as he's fully resigning himself to his fate at that point. I thought that was really, that sort of thing is really beautifully done, and he really knows how to just really play that violin very well. Another very interesting symbol to me was the symbol of the broken the broken boat, the sea vessel that they go to visit at one point, that has run aground and is no longer seaworthy. What I thought, that was such an interesting thing, that he object that he placed within the story, because I feel like he knew what we were going to be expecting from that boat, which was that's going to be what they fix up. They're going to fix up the boat, push it out to sea, and that's going to be how they escape this world. They're going to return to they're going to go out to the ocean, and that's when they'll find like the island of escapees or something like that. That kind of is what we're expecting. And I felt like it was so very quietly poignant that they just want to look at this boat because they've never seen a boat, and then they just leave it and they don't think about it again. They don't do anything with it because it doesn't occur to them, hey, we could patch this thing up and get out of here or something like that. And I thought that was, he never says what the purpose of visiting that boat was, but I felt like that was just very strong, that carrot on a stick that he's dangling for us.
Yeah, I don't like. I would not have liked like a symbolic, and they go off into the water and the mists cover them, and the end, like that would have been kind of lackluster. Yeah. And I'm glad he shied away from that. I'm glad he had hard endings and resolved stuff, yeah, and everything made sense. And the only mystery, as I mentioned before, was the cabinet. We don't know what the cabinet was all about from the dean or whomever was in the house.
Yeah.
But that was a strange reveal conversation thing going on. It's like, yeah, she's in the wheelchair and they're trying to have a conversation. There's people coming in the door and she's like, talking backwards. Like what? Yeah. What's going? Yeah.
I thought it was so interesting talking about that scene, that he sets up this potential time constraint where she's saying, I've got these service people coming over to the house, and once they're here, I'll need to go deal with that. And it was so interesting to me because it's like she knows full well that this is like the most important thing in the world to these characters. And she's saying, she's treating it like this very mundane, dismissive thing, like, oh, when these people get here, I'll have to go take care of this. But while we're here, before they get here, we'll talk. And I thought that was so interesting because we at that it's like even then she's emphasizing to them, your problems, the greatest problems in the world, don't really matter to anything. We're still reminding you that you're a secondary interest to us as a whole, and that sort of thing. So I thought there was some very very powerful stuff in there. But at the same time, I mean, you talk about the paintings in the gallery, and it was fairly, once I knew that, I went into this book not knowing anything about it except that it's about clones. That was the only thing I knew about it. Once it was revealed that they were going to be used for organ harvesting, I was once that came across, I automatically knew what the gallery was for. It's like, yep, the gallery they're doing some kind of big humanitarian drive to show the world these are the paintings of the clones, and they're real people too, and all of that. I knew that it was going to be something like that, and sure enough, it was. So that that aspect of it wasn't too surprising. But yeah, I mean, so I think on the whole, if I'm summarizing this book, it's one of those things where it's like the the premise itself, I mean, the story itself is very secondary to the thought processes of these characters and just kind of the heartbreaking naivete that they all seem to have and that sort of thing.
Well, that's the problem, I think, because we came. I was thinking, okay, this is going to be, or not necessarily artsy fartsy, but sort of this avant-garde, well-written concept of a dystopian. It was just a bunch of people, a bunch of kids having drama in their normal childhood and trying to understand what's going on. I'm thinking, I bet anyone could have written this growing up.
Yeah.
And then there's this sort of alternate anachronistic world going on. And and if he was in his college years studying medicine, he wouldn't have even thought of this, because we have solutions for a lot of these, this like cancer and heart conditions. Like, there's just solutions for that. You don't need to freaking clone people and have this gigantic system and all these bodies running around. It's like, but the premise is fine. Because it didn't go into hard details, and it was okay. So that's why I say it was written so well. As much as I hated the first half, that because he didn't delve into those details and just focused on the psychology and the personalities, then it was okay. Plus, he resolved everything. So that is why it's a good book, not because of the premise and the juvenile scenarios. So there are some things I dislike, which I did catch. You might have caught them too. The first quarter, I actually tracked it to make sure I was right. I'd say about 25 to 20% was the first half of her memory of Hailsham, which she says was all a blur. And it's like, it was all a blur, but you spent a quarter of the book telling me about nothing. Like, why would you do that?
Right.
Yeah, it was kind of weird. The other one, which I also really liked, this is more of a meta commentary, where she's looking for stories or movies or depictions of sex, because she wants to know about sex. She wants to see it, what it looks like.
Yeah.
And then there is actually sex in the book, and it doesn't go into any visceral detail or anything. I thought that was rather like, yeah, that's why you don't do it, because the story is for a certain audience. You don't go into visceral detail on contemporary PG-14 stories. So stuff like that I thought was rather little interesting thing. Annoying the first one, because it's like, why did you tell us all this? Like, they could have skipped, honestly, the first 40%. Leave at least I don't know, 2 chapters about the mundane nature and the relationship between Tommy and Kath and some of the main characters they were with. That would have been fine, just to get the world going. Without it, we'd be like, who are these people? What do they want? And what are they doing? So I think if it was a longer short story or a shorter novella, it would have been perfect, because a lot of this stuff, my brain is like, if Kurt Vonnegut did this, he would just cut out 80% of this crap, go boom, 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 have a fun little thing happening at the end, and then have a nice little denouement. And I would have thought, this is brilliant. And it ended up being a slow just descent, and then just big reveal, and then and it just goes down from there, and you're like, okay,
right.
So
I was thinking, I called it a slow burn earlier, and really you could say it's a burn that's so slow you don't know if it's burning at all. It pretty much. Cool. So I think a good diversity of opinion on this book. I really enjoyed it. I was really glad I read it, and I think I probably glommed onto it a little more than you did. But other than that, I totally get where you're coming from on everything. So the fundamental question we always close with: would you recommend it? I would. I would recommend it as a character study, as a study in the evolution of human emotions and connectivity between people, the kind of the heartbreaking naivete of people living in accepting their role in an oppressive society and that sort of thing. There's just these beautiful vignettes of emotion that I would say are why I would recommend it. What do you think?
To the average reader, no, because you can't just pick it up and go, oh, slice of life, I can't wait. Oh, juvenile scenarios, I can't wait. Like, that's not going to appeal to people.
Yeah.
outside of it has clones, but then there's really no talk of science or science fiction or any of those themes till way late, and even then it's just one conversation.
Yeah.
I liken it to uh, Anton Chekhov and the lady
Yeah.
with the dog book, which breaks a lot of rules, and that's a short story. So this is, if you like reading, if you like having stories told in a different manner, in a slow way that pays off, because I hate to tell the average reader, oh, it gets better, you know, because it's
Yeah.
I don't want people to go through half an experience which is ugh.
Yeah.
But to people who like reading, that's normal. That's pretty common.
Right.
So, and this is not a long book, so
Yeah.
it's fairly fine for the average reader who likes reading. So, not to the layman, not to the average reader, but to the person who likes reading and who knows that rules can be broken. And I was happy that we went away from the genre, which the
Hmm.
Japanese authors are known for, and into a more solidified, oh, things get resolved scenario. And I think if they didn't have that, I didn't even know it was a movie. If they didn't have that resolution at
Yeah.
the end, this wouldn't. How could you make this a movie? It's just a bunch of kids, you know,
Yeah.
going through their day
Yeah.
for years and years. Like, that's not very fun. That's not very interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would recommend it to people who like reading. So
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, that wraps us up for this installment of Book Talk with Jordan and Stefan. For Stefan DiIorio, I'm Jordan Owen. Thank you for your time, and join us next time on Book Talk when our book will be Tender is the Flesh by Augustina Bazterrica.